Thank you very much, everyone, and thank you for coming to what promises to be a really fascinating debate with a great group of panelists whom I will introduce in a minute. But first of all, just to talk about the theme of the debate. Rationality, which was once revered, has had a bit of a bad press. It's increasingly derided as the rhetorical bluster of an educated elite, most typically white and male, and as a prejudiced claim of those who are sure that they're in the right. Yet in the absence of reason, public debate risks becoming ever more rancorous and tribal. So do we need less emotion, more calm and more rational conversation and debate? Should we see rationality as a method for positive change and a mechanism for good decision-making? Or is rationality, in fact, a rhetorical delusion, a means of dressing up privilege and power, which should be seen for what it is, a defense of the vested interests it seeks to hide? Well, let's ask all these speakers. I'm going to introduce them all. Lena Power is a cultural critic, social theorist, philosopher and translator. Formerly a senior lecturer in philosophy at Roehampton University, Nina's interests are in philosophy, art, feminism and politics. Timothy Williamson, I'm allowed to call him Tim apparently, is the Wickham Professor of Logic at the University of Oxford. His most eminent works include The Philosophy of Philosophy and Knowledge and Its Limits. That's very meta. And Sophie Archer is a distinguished academic specializing in the philosophy of mind, psychology and epistemology. She was the Robin Geffen Research Fellow and Tutor in Philosophy at the University of Oxford and now lectures at the University of Cardiff. So, a 3-minute pitch from each of them. Because they're all academics, I've decided to say to them, we've got to define our terms. What do we mean by rationality? Tim, over to you.
Yeah, well, I think some philosophers have a rather narrow conception of rationality as sort of based on calculation, some kind of formal consistency. And that seems to me way too narrow and a very inadequate way of thinking what it is. I mean, roughly speaking, the way I think of rationality, it's some kind of openness to getting new evidence and disposition to act and to form beliefs in ways that are appropriate given your evidence. And that's something that I would see as coming in degrees, so that adults are typically more rational than 2-year-old children. The 2-year-old children are not totally lacking in rationality. And I would even think of rationality as something that can be found in somewhat primitive forms in many non-human animals. I mean, so that, for example, when you think of a predator hunting a prey, I mean, they're both typically, they've got to be able to act in some way in the light of their evidence. I mean, their evidence about where the other animal is and about what there is in their environment, stuff to hide behind, and all those kind of things. And so if they were acting in completely irrational ways which paid no attention to their evidence, they're not likely to withstand the test of evolution for very long. So it's actually an extremely widespread phenomenon over a whole range of species. Of course, with human rationality, we've got language, and we can use language to reflect in explicit sort of ways about our evidence, and that enables us to be rational in much more sophisticated ways to recognize ways in which our sort of initial instincts may actually be mistaken, and then we can correct them. And so that's, as it were, an extra layer of rationality that we have that isn't available in the same way to creatures that don't have language. But basically, we're just talking about different levels of something that is extremely widespread amongst living creatures.
Great, thank you. Nina?
Yeah, I guess first of all I'd say that everybody thinks, and I'd be very wary of anyone who would say otherwise. And in that sense, I think we have to understand that everybody has reasons for the claims that they make. And I think it's often very disingenuous when we seek to present our opponents, if you like, as being motivated by extra rational concerns alone. So, and this often happens in particularly emotive debates, where we seek to assert that the other person is motivated by something malicious, they're motivated by hate, perhaps. Whereas if you actually want to have a dialogue with somebody, you have to assume something like the principle of charity, which is that basically the person's argument they have good reasons for why they're claiming what they claim, and you argue against that. And I think we need to have more of an understanding of the sort of necessity and reality of dialogue, and the fact that people give different reasons for different positions, and that everybody thinks is basically a fundamental axiom. At the same time, I think it's very difficult to think for oneself, even though that seems very obvious that this is something we all grant ourselves. It's actually very difficult to find out sometimes what it is that we actually think about a particular issue. We're surrounded by opinion and doxa and kind of a whole confusing array of information, and it often takes time to work through an idea or an argument. And I think reason is one of those things that helps us to think it's not everything. I do think, though, that reason and emotion, for example, shouldn't be opposed. If you read someone like Spinoza, he says that basically emotion and these ideas of these kind of feelings, that they're also amenable to comprehension, so that we can actually get a bigger picture of why we feel the way we do, why we feel, for example, envy towards someone, why we feel confusion in another context. We can actually access reason to talk about emotion. So I wouldn't necessarily oppose reason and emotion either. I would say that a narrow image of rationality, for example, the idea that human beings are only fundamentally calculating, for example, like economic rationality, is not the sum total of how we think about things. And so I would also defend the idea of reason as having a speculative element, which is to say, asking questions that we can't immediately answer, maybe asking questions that are very grandiose, asking questions about the cosmos, about the nature of our soul, about whether God exists or not, whether our soul is immortal. You know, Kant talks about reason as basically pushing us to ask questions that we can't answer. So I think reason also has this kind of cosmic, speculative, philosophical dimension, and it's not always going to be able to solve those questions, but it kind of pushes us to ask them. And in that sense, I think it's something very beautiful and something that we can engage in together in dialogue. And this is, in a way, what philosophical dialogue is all about, is reasoning together. It's not something that we can necessarily only do on our own, even at the same time as we want to try to understand what it is that we actually think about any particular issue. So I think there should be more reason. I think that everyone has reason. I think that everyone can give reasons. And we should be able to talk about everything that matters to us without being shut down.
So you're using reason as a synonym for rationality here?
Yeah, I mean, we could talk about complicated definitions, but yes, let's say, for the sake of this conversation.
Yeah. Okay, great, yeah. Thank you. Sophie.
Hi. So I think that sometimes by rationality, people mean something like responding well to reasons. And if that's what we mean by rationality, then I think that it's pretty clear that human beings don't do that most of the time. In fact, we're kind of notoriously irrational. So, you know, we believe things because we want to believe them rather than because the evidence suggests that they're true. So apparently 90% of people believe that they're more beautiful and more intelligent than average, which obviously...
And better drivers too.
Yes, yeah, which obviously can't be true for all of us. And we're also massively practically irrational as well. So, you know, we sincerely resolve to give up smoking, and then half an hour later we're lighting up the next cigarette, right? So we're massively irrational. So if by rationality we mean something like responding well to reasons, then I think it's clear that we're not very rational for the most part in that sense. However, there's another sense of rationality, I think, where it is more reasonable to say that we are rational, which is that we have the capacity to respond to reasons, right? If by being rational we mean that someone has the capacity to respond to reasons, then ironically enough, all of that irrationality only serves to establish that we are rational in that other sense, right? That we have the capacity to respond to reasons, because we wouldn't be able to be irrational, that is to say, we wouldn't be able to exercise that capacity poorly unless we had that capacity. So that's the distinction between two senses of rationality, and I'll leave it there for now, I think.
Okay.
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below, or visit iai.tv for more debates and talks from the world's leading thinkers on today's biggest ideas.